I'm Lindsay Woodson. I'm the president of SMAD, and I just want to introduce. Thank you. I just want to introduce our keynote speaker for our event. Our symposium has been going all week, and we have our exhibition in the Marble Room. If you get a chance, please go down and check it out. This is Stephanie Johnston, and she's with Article 25, and she's going to be talking about different ways to improve the notion of disaster proofing within architecture, engineering, a bunch of different ways to do it. So this is Stephanie, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, good. First of all, I'm very, very pleased to be here, and I just wanted to commend Syracuse and the School of Architecture for being quite broad-minded and quite forward-thinking about the notion of design being important in disaster response and also disaster proofing, so both after and before, if you like, a disaster has happened. Believe it or not, that's an agenda that doesn't always come up, particularly within architectural training, certainly in the UK. So this is an agenda that I'm really delighted to be speaking on, and I'm really, really pleased that Syracuse has an interest in that. And I hope you find it interesting. Okay, so we're going to talk today. Well, first of all, I'm going to introduce you to Article 25 and what we do, and then we're going to talk about some of the systems around disaster proofing and disaster response, and some of the techniques. And then what I'm going to try and do is unpack those systems for you and get you to question some of the sort of mechanisms that we work by in this field. So the reason I'm starting with this particular slide here is to illustrate one of our projects in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which you may or may not know has been conflict-ridden for almost decades now. What we're talking about today is the implications for design in really, really challenging contexts. In this context, the reason that these guys are creating bricks out of the ground is because this site where we're building 2 schools is a 3-day walk from the nearest road. So if you cannot carry it up there yourself, you can't build with it. So you have to find everything on the site. So immediately the implications for design around materials are massive. It's also a very low skill set. There aren't any, you can't ask people to read architectural drawings up there. You've got to come up with other ways to be able to communicate your design. And in our experience, our architect actually had to leave in the middle of the night because the rebels were moving in and she was moved. So we had to create a design that we knew could get built without us being there, because we knew that we would probably not be able to be on site for the whole time. Massive, massive implications for quality control there, and you've got to be able to design it to stand up to that in your absence. But the other thing that this image demonstrates is that this is a sort of a relief effort, if you like, in the midst of an ongoing disaster. So we're talking about a short-term solution to an education infrastructure that's completely collapsed. But what we're also talking about is the long-term, and I want you to bear that in mind, the differential between short-term relief, which is where a lot of the media attention goes on, and the long-term reconstruction efforts to rebuild a society. In this case, investing in education, and education is widely seen to be the sort of key route out of poverty, certainly in the developing world. Oh, what have I done now? No, shall I use this? Sorry. There we go. So, quick introduction to Article 25 for you. This is an image of one of our earliest projects. It's a school in Goa for street children. So again, we're looking at a vulnerable group in society who are all but invisible to the majority of society. Again, huge implications for the design. How do you build a building for a group of people who are largely invisible, and you don't necessarily want to reinforce that stigma through giving them a whopping great building which has their kind of stigma emblazoned all over it. I'll come back to this image in a moment to talk a bit more about one of the principles behind what we do. I promise I don't have very many slides that has lots of text on it. I'm not into text. But our vision, international development agencies and NGOs like us often have a vision statement, which is usually rather grandiose. It's usually a sort of all-encompassing statement, but what it is a way that we want to see the world after we've done what we've done. So ours is to see a world where the human right to adequate shelter is met. A world where there is never a life nor livelihood lost due to the lack of a building, appropriate design or construction skills. Lovely, very useful for attracting funds, but what does that actually mean? It means that we design and build and manage projects with partner NGOs to provide better shelter where there is disaster, poverty and need. So who do we work with? As I said, we work with aid organisations, NGOs and communities around the world, basically helping them to use construction and design skills where they would normally not use them. As I'm sure you're aware, architecture and design skills are often seen as elitist, but in fact, where they can have the greatest impact is in some of these most challenging contexts. So that's what we do. We exist in order to make those skills available to NGOs. A lot of NGOs won't invest in design because they think it's expensive, they think it's elitist, they think that they'll be able to get away with a contractor-led design. It often doesn't work. As a result, the developing world is unfortunately littered with incredibly well-meant but incredibly badly executed buildings, which it's a waste of time and a waste of money. So that's why we exist. Building solutions to global problems is our strapline, and these four sort of areas of work are our mission statements. You can all read, so I'm not going to read them out to you. However, I'd just like to draw on the last one, education. We believe really strongly in the need to be raising awareness of this agenda amongst the sort of upcoming generation of professionals. Not necessarily to be working in this field, but to understand how to apply their design skills in a way that really, really stretches the boundaries and really understand how to address some major, major challenges in the world, which is what I'm doing here, and which is why I do an awful lot of this work in the UK as well. Again, I'll come back to this a little bit later. So these are some images just to illustrate some of the core modus operandi, the sort of values that we work by. Operational, we use that word a lot. That's an image of our CEO, Robin Cross, in the field in Pakistan, launching the third phase of our reconstruction programme of earthquake-resistant housing after the 2005 earthquake. That photograph was taken in early 2010. So that gives you an indication of how long it takes to recover from a disaster, way, way, way after the media's been there and gone. And that we are very much there for the long term, and design is very much has to think in terms of the long term. Added value, that's an image of the school in Goa that I mentioned before. The reason that that image is there to explain added value is because a lot of the projects that we are called on to help with NGOs, quite often they've already started and something's gone wrong and they've realised that they need to invest in design. And hopefully, if as we grow and as time goes on, people will call us first before they go spending any money on anything. In this case, the contractor was leading the design, and with the budget that the NGO set, suggested a school that would be able to accommodate 300 children. They got about halfway through, they fell out, there was quite a lot of corruption going on. This is reasonably normal. And the school was about yay high, so we were called in to try and deal with it. There was a certain amount of money left, there was a certain amount more coming, so we took the design, which was already sort of semi-existent, and we built a school on exactly the same budget for 1,200 children, so it's 4 times as many kids. So that is a very, very tangible example of how there's only design that's done that, is able to kind of crack this really pressing need in the developing world. Community first, that's an image of a workshop that was carried out in Sierra Leone in the middle of the rainforest. Believe it or not, there is rainforest in Sierra Leone. And we always work bottom up. We always work in consultation with as many of the stakeholders as possible, but absolutely first and foremost, the people who are going to actually use that building. I know it sounds like a no-brainer that you talk to the people who are going to use the building, but for example, when I was at university, nobody definitely spoke to any students about their halls of residence and how they would use it. It's not something we're encouraged to do. You sort of, you do your lovely drawings, and often the people are missing from the drawings, or they become very, very abstract. And for us, certainly, it generates, I'll talk about this a bit more later, but it generates a more sustainable product, and just basically a product that is more appropriate for the people who are going to use it. And we can't get it wrong in this context. You have to be working with the people who are going to be using the building. So we always start with the community. Raising awareness, that is a photograph of a workshop going on in the University of Sheffield in England, exploring the use of building with bamboo. And as I said earlier, like investing our time in education and raising awareness is really quite important to us. And this is one of our workshops that we carry out with our student societies up and down the country. So this is just one of them in practice to show you that we do really believe in this agenda. Global operations, this is our colonisation map. This is showing the places where we work in the world. It's where there is need. There is no particular reason why a lot of it is in sub-Saharan Africa, other than that's where a lot of work is. We have been on the Indian subcontinent for quite a while. We've also worked in Eastern Europe. That tiny little island over there, half an island, for anyone who doesn't know, is Haiti and has been sucking up a huge amount of time in the office recently. We've got a rebuilding program of about 30 schools, which is pretty ambitious even for us. Papua New Guinea, Chile, all over the place really. And these are the kind of people we work with. So some of them, when I say we partner up with NGOs, some of them are big ones that I'm sure you'll recognise. Save the Children are up there. The IFRC, the International Federation of the Red Cross. So some of them are quite large. DFID is the Department for International Development. That's the equivalent of USAID in the UK. Outreach International is a US organisation as well. And some of them are much smaller, and they're really small, like one-off projects, like one building, or even just a feasibility report or an evaluation. So it really doesn't matter. It's where there's disaster, poverty or need. So long as you can prove the need, then we're more than happy to work on it. Part of the way that we're able to provide these services is because of our operational models, and we are able to keep costs really, really, really low. It's like a fraction of commercial fees. It is not for profit. It's a not-for-profit model. And part of the reason we can do that is because we leverage in the support of some major organisations in the UK who will donate their time and their members of staff pro bono to our work. So, for example, if we've got a project where we need an environmental engineer and we haven't got one in-house, we can call upon, say, Price & Myers, which is a large engineering firm in the UK, to lend us one of their environmental engineers. So that's how we get that to work. And we've worked with some fairly major names. I mean, in the UK, these are all fairly large organisations. Foster & Partners, we've been very lucky to work with because Lord Norman Foster is one of our trustees. So that's how that sort of relationship started, was they were working with us pro bono. Pierre Davoine is also a reasonably well-known architect. Anyway, so there's a few. Who are we building for? I like this image because it shows a few things. It's the front cover actually of a exhibition that was going on in New York City a few years ago at the Cooper Hewitt Museum. That's the cover of the exhibition catalogue, and if anybody's interested in this, you can order this through Amazon. It's a really interesting catalogue. But what we're talking about here is, I'm going to say it again and again, 90%, hang on, let me get this right, 10% of the world's design skills and built environment skills are expended on 90%. Oh, God, I've got it wrong. I always do this. Let me see, 90% of the world's design skills are expended on 10% of the world's population. So a lot of skills goes on a tiny, tiny proportion, and it is an elitist discipline that we're talking about here. So we're talking about designing for the other 90% of people who do not have access to these services. And what this image shows is that we're not just talking about buildings, we're talking about the power of design. That's not a building, that's a product. It's called a life straw, and it cleans the water as you drink it to make water potable. So it shows both an interdisciplinary approach, much in the spirit of multicultural architects and designers, and it also shows the kind of massively disproportionate number of people that the world's design skills are being spent on. So we're just coming to the end of the sort of introduction to Article 25. This is the education programme, which we are lucky enough to enjoy the support of the Department for International Development, which is our UK aid, if you like. We run a range of activities, right from the CPDs is a professional accreditation in the UK for architects. They're required to undertake a certain number of hours of continuing professional development to maintain their professional qualification. student chapters. The reason that's in blue is because that is one of the things that if you guys are interested in this, it's something that would be a really easy way for you to carry on being involved. We have societies up and down the country in the UK, and we're talking to university in Cairo, although that went quiet a few weeks ago, and in Islamabad and a couple of other places as well, Nebraska, a few places, about setting up a group of upcoming professionals who are interested in this agenda. Research, we do a lot of collaborative research like the Bamboo Project. I'll show you a couple of more. We've run quite a few modules now, supervised PhDs, masters. And we also host an online forum. It's called the Knowledge Community, which is run by the Royal Institute of British Architects, but it's very much international website. What it's meant to do is join up built environment professionals with live design challenges in the field. So international development professionals in the field can be, say, like, you know, it's going to flood next month and we need to figure out how to get our animal shelters sorted out immediately. Does anyone know how to raise a particular type of building? And that's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to be like a live Q&A, a lot of blogs, a lot of posted discussion forums. Again, it's something I can give you information on if you'd like to join it. And that's my name in really big letters. This is just to tell you why I'm here and why I'm qualified to talk to you about what I'm talking to you about. I'm the Education and Communications Manager at Article 25, so I do a lot of our outreach work. I'm also responsible for our sort of public face, so our website. Don't go looking at our website for a few weeks. We're launching a new one. The one that we currently have is pretty basic. And all of our sort of promotional materials and all of that, and also a lot of talking, a lot of speaking to universities, professionals, and so on. I did my training at the University College London at the Bartlett School of Architecture, which was a very interesting degree. It was very interdisciplinary, and it had this great big long name, which I won't bother reading out. My thing is participatory planning, and that's really what I started in and what I came to Article 25 to do. As you saw in that photograph of the children in Sierra Leone with the large format paper, which totally blew them away, we do a lot of community engagement, and we would not be able to achieve such successful buildings without it. So I work on the strategy around a lot of our projects. That's some of them. Those are the sort of post-disaster ones that I've worked on. The majority of my field experience has been in Istanbul on what is politely termed an alternative development plan for low-income areas. It's basically a slum clearance programme. Which went ahead, but we were trying to develop alternatives for resettlement of the communities there. But what I think that illustrates is that it doesn't necessarily happen in sub-Saharan Africa. It can happen in a totally modernised European country as well. This need for design is all around. And in fact, I was just talking to one of your staff about local initiatives going on. And usually it's the best place to start looking is look as close to home as you possibly can, because there's always a need for this sort of design. Okay, does anyone have any questions about Article 25 before I carry on? How we work? No? I do quite like being interrupted. Yes. Hello.
It seems like you do a combination of work where maybe other NGOs bring you in as partners or consultants.
Yeah.
But I get the sense that you're kind of proactive in seeking out contexts and helping people recognize the tools that you bring. What are some of the ways you get engaged in that?
To date, we've never sourced work. It comes in the door. There's unfortunately no lack of it. It's a really weird way to work, to try and work yourself out of a job so that people don't need you and they know how to sort of, a community is equipped with the sort of skills, I'll go into this a bit later, to be able to build themselves. So we haven't sourced work. However, much of my role is also talking at things like international development consortiums and conferences, just to try and make sure that if people don't know how to build, if organisations don't know how to build, they do seek design expertise first, because it's such a shame when it becomes a box-ticking exercise and a concrete building goes up in an earthquake zone, which will probably kill someone, or it'll be abandoned or vandalised. It is a real shame that it's hard-won funds, and the international development industry is only getting more competitive, and trying to keep hold of those funds is tough. So I think it's a combination of a track record, a good track record, Some of the larger names do tend to spread the word about us, like Save the Children and the Red Cross. So I think it's a combination of that and then the sort of work that my team does as well. Just a lot of outreach, really, and getting the word out. Anyone else? Hi.
How did Article 25 get involved in the continuing professional development program? That's pretty interesting.
Yeah. CPD in the UK is, unfortunately, I mean, it's a really, really interesting tool. It's something that the Royal Institute of British Architects, if you're accredited, they require you to upkeep your profession, so you're learning constantly, which is great. However, what it's turned into is basically commercial companies pushing products. So they will turn up at architectural practices, major firms, over lunch hour. Everybody who needs to rack up their CPD hours will go in, be bored to death about carpet tiles or guttering for an hour, and then tick it off in their logbook, and that's it, they're done. So we could see that the mechanism, the sort of structure was there for us to offer something that was really quite interesting. To be honest, we're up against it because these people who are pushing their products, they offer them for free and they'll even bring lunch to try and get people in the room. We don't, we need to seek like a small donation in order to make it sustainable. But it's something that our next courses, we run 2 one-day courses every quarter, if that makes sense. So we've got enough material to run quite a comprehensive program. And for example, the next ones are March 17th and 18th, and they're totally oversubscribed, completely. Like, we've only got capacity for about 22 people because we get the venue for free. So if we could pay for a larger venue, we could accommodate, I think there's about 50 inquiries at the moment. So it's a great mechanism that was already there. And a lot of our trustees, well, 3 of our trustees are past presidents of the Royal Institute of British Architects. So it was an opportunity we couldn't really miss. And we recognised it as a really good way to get the word out, basically. And actually, as a result, we've ended up with a lot of volunteers, and a lot of the pro bono practices come to us through those CPDs, which is great. It works really well. Well worth the time.
So do you work on the business models? So this base of the pyramid, or the other 90%, that architects and design firms might actually be able to commit to work on this profitably, or is it all just expected to be pro bono and humanitarian?
To be perfectly honest, it depends on the NGO and it depends on the project. That first of all, when there is no way we get even close to commercial fees. But for example, we have a large-scale project in Sierra Leone at the moment, which has come to us through the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, believe it or not. And they have more members than all of our political parties put together. And they have a strong interest in conserving the natural habitat of where their birds go around the world. So they came to us with a big budget, and we obviously aren't going to sort of rinse them for it, but at the same time, if they can cover the cost of, we have our overheads and we have the computers costs to run and the space costs to rent, and with the volunteers, like, if we can, we try and cover their expenses. So we break it down for them. We usually produce about 2 or 3 models for them, and one is sort of really, really base rate, like all volunteer skills. Another one, like if we can persuade them to be able to afford to put one of our project architects, our staffed project architects on it, then they'll take that one. Or sometimes it's a body of work that they'll come to you and they've got a budget and they're happy to give you that budget to do it. But it's an odd model, but it really works. It's not one that I've recognised anywhere else. But it does really, really work. And I think a lot of the reason why it works is because of the volunteer structure and the pro bono structure. None of the organisations that we leverage in, like the engineering skills, we would never approach them offering some sort of fee, because that's just not in the nature of how we've worked to date. And to be honest, we don't need to. We get plenty of people wanting to do it. Okay, so I'm going to get onto the nitty-gritty. So to start with, I'm going to give you a little bit of theory, in case you haven't had enough of it. We're just going to briefly look at the disaster response cycle, and I don't know if it's something you may have heard of it before, you may have heard of DRR before, but I'll just walk you through it really briefly so you understand what some of the mechanisms and the key systems that design professionals have to be aware of when they're working in this kind of context. So we'll look at 2 ideas, the idea of DRR and the idea of shelter. The next part is joined up thinking, which is then trying to unpack these systems, looking at how design techniques can help to dislocate some of the sort of perceived methods of working, and basically help improve long-term sustainability. And so it's very, very easy to think of disasters as a short-term thing. It's absolutely not. It's a very much a combination of looking at the immediate and the long-term. And then the third part we'll talk about, as I've already touched on, participatory development. I'll give you a couple of examples, and this is about understanding authority of knowledge and whose authority comes into play, and how the designer's authority is very much more powerful when combined with that of others and the knowledge of others. It's a really crucial technique to achieving a sustainable outcome, and something that we would never not do. And then the last part, we'll just go back to the theme and do a brief sum up of what we're actually talking about and where we're trying to get towards. The disaster response cycle. So I'm sure you've seen hundreds of images like this. We get somewhat brainwashed by them. They are important. It's incredibly important to elicit funds in the aftermath of a disaster. But at the same time, what are the systems in place, and what are the mechanisms in place that the international community work by when things like this happen, and what on earth has it got to do with the built environment? So that's what I'm hopefully going to tell you next. Nice little equation for you. What we're talking about here is when we talk about a disaster, it's a combination of an event having an impact on people. That there are various ways to measure a disaster, and there are various definitions of a disaster, but it's not an earthquake. It's an earthquake that has devastated a certain number of people in a specific way. So just to walk you through this, if you're standing in the middle of a field when an earthquake happens, it's not a disaster, you're probably going to be fine. So it's a combination of two things. The hazard here, hazard is the thing you can't necessarily change. The earthquake, the floods, the tsunami, whatever it might be. Vulnerability, that's the thing that you can change. Somebody's vulnerability is their inability to cope in the face of a disaster. And those two together mean that you are at risk of being affected negatively by a hazard. So what we're talking about here is reducing vulnerability in order to reduce risk exposure. If are there any economists in the room, or anybody who's worked with sort of statistics, risk exposure is something that lots and lots of industries use. So what we're really talking about is reducing vulnerability. For anybody who's into definitions, these are a couple of ways of describing a disaster, and I've just pulled out in bold some of the words that I've touched on: vulnerability, capacity to cope. They don't just happen, they result from failures of development which increase your vulnerability to hazardous events. So this is it. This is the disaster response cycle. It's an academic model, which, as always, has its strengths and weaknesses, but it is incredibly useful for sort of organising efforts around a disaster, and importantly, actually funding is also usually allocated along the lines of the disaster response cycle. So you can get funds that are just allocated to relief or just allocated to reconstruction, and they're usually tied to time. So it's impossible to measure how long a relief stage is going to be, but absurdly, you get pieces of funding that are tied to a specific period. So relief is supposed to be finished in 3 months, or reconstruction funds won't be released until relief funds have been spent. And if they don't get spent, they go back. They go back into, well, they get redistributed in a number of ways. So the way that this works is this is theoretically where the disaster strikes, and then you have a relief phase. I'm gonna show you some images to illustrate these phases. Rehabilitation and urban recovery, moving on to reconstruction, which is perhaps relief and reconstruction, which is where you see kind of the role of the built environment the most. But I will argue that actually the other side of that dotted line, we're talking about disaster proofing, and that's where there's a very, very important role to play. Mitigation and prevention, and disaster preparedness. Okay. There are a lot of R words involved. These phases down the bottom here are also often called response and recovery. And the whole thing together is what I was referring to as DRR, disaster risk reduction. There are whole degrees you can do in disaster risk reduction. If you Google it, you will find hundreds of resources. There are whole research bodies dedicated to it. So if you're interested, do look it up. There are lots and lots of implications for design and different codes written around DRR. So then just briefly looking at the concept of shelter, which is something that runs parallel to the idea of DRR, but is specifically related to the built environment. So it's another model, it's another way of thinking, but it's definitely the one that's most relevant for us as designers. Potted history of shelter, which is by no means a definitive history, but rather a snapshot of how architecture has responded over the years. On the far left, around the sort of late 1700s, that is what has come to be known as a Victorian-era slum. Those kind of high-rise, brick-built buildings, which now we know massively endangered public health, were symptomatic of the industrialisation era, where it was the answer to mass movements of people and the need for mass accommodation, which caused all sorts of its own disasters. Around 1900, that image is from the San Francisco earthquake, and Golden Gate Park was covered in little sheds like that. That was what was known as an internally displaced persons camp, an IDP camp, and remained that way for a number of years because the government, this was the first real example of where there was a political initiative to respond in a more sophisticated way to the problem of mass movements of people and how to mitigate that turning into something much more serious and disastrous. These sheds were sold off. There were sort of financial models around it. So they were sold off to the people who were affected by the earthquake. So you're reinstating like land ownership. And then business-minded people started becoming quite entrepreneurial and buying up more than one, and then using some of them as warehousing, using some of them as commercial premises. So you've got a real development happening because the idea of sort of transitional shelter was really well thought out. And that was really the first, well, the best example and the earliest example of where that happened. From about 1950 on, you get really quite complex emergencies, lots of people moving around, not necessarily natural disasters, lots of political reasons why people are moving. The ubiquitous tents, which have long been the solution to providing shelter for people in emergencies. But there has been much more of a exploration of how to join up the short term and the long term, so how to move from transitional to permanent shelter and the importance of infrastructure. The image on the right is an image of our earthquake-resistant housing in Pakistan, which I'll talk to you about a little bit later. And there's a reason why that's there to illustrate the difference between a tent and a more permanent looking and a more permanent behaving house dwelling. So this is the idea. You move from emergency shelter through to permanent shelter. So tents, plastic sheeting, whatever it may be, those are the FEMA trailers from after the New Orleans disaster. That's much more of a transitional environment to be in. The sort of definition of transitional is somewhere where you can get a return to normal daily activities. So that in itself was a design solution. The next photo is from Chile after their earthquake last year, and that was a flat pack kit house. The fence around it, I'm sorry it's not the best image, but the fence around it was something that the owner of that house built. So you can see that it's a very instinctive thing for humans to start marking territory again. And you can see sort of pot plants and things happening. So that's very much indicating a transition back to normalcy. And then on to permanent housing, which should be looking to the long term, things like earthquake resistance. The most important thing to me to remember is that a transitional shelter in one context could be an emergency or a permanent shelter in another. These stages are all fluid. It's not useful, in my opinion, to try and think of the disaster response cycle or shelter along timelines, along temporal lines at all. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to just talk through the stages of the cycle quickly, and I said I'd show you some images that would just illustrate those, and specifically illustrate the role of design in those stages. So very quickly, as soon as a disaster strikes, you have this relief phase, which this is theoretically the model that relief works by. So you work from the bottom up. Precautionary evacuation if possible, rescue next to are based on medical needs, and then the establishment of temporary shelters. Interestingly, that comes before the provision of food, water and emergency items, which you'd think that came first. And certainly the images that you see coming out in the media, it's all about, scrums for food and water as opposed to temporary shelters. It doesn't get an awful lot of coverage. It's not the kind of most headline-grabbing topic. There's a very, very good reason for that. If you get people to sit still, and if you are able to, in some way, impart a sense of territory on people who've just been through a reasonably enormous trauma, you are far more likely to be able to distribute aid a lot easier. And it's vital that the role of infrastructure and the role of camp planning and the role of design, it kicks in immediately in order to be able to facilitate that next crucial stage of being able to distribute food and water. A lot of the images that you saw coming out of Haiti was chaos, and those images are created for a reason, because they need to elicit funds. They need to get the general public all over the world putting their hands in their pockets. But those chaotic images don't last that long. Very, very quickly, with good infrastructure, there were, certainly in Port-au-Prince, there were set designated areas like pick-up points for food. There were lines with people with tokens. There were good systems in place, and it was down to the built environment and the role of the built environment and being able to re-establish adequate systems of distribution that made that possible. So again, in relief, this is precautionary evacuation. There was obviously zero in Haiti because there was no early warning system in place, and certainly the technological advances in architecture can help to produce early warning systems. Yeah, I don't really like these images very much. This is a photograph of plastic sheets, which are stockpiled all over the world, and this is it. This is our response. This is the response, the best response we've got to what happens immediately after disaster and how to get people to sit still. I'm sure there's a reason why plastic sheeting is the best response that we've got. It's waterproof. It helps that very, very basic marking of territory to happen, which has a huge psychological impact. But, you know, are there alternatives? Is there a way to then use that plastic sheeting as sort of a component part of more transitional housing? Could it be used for a different purpose? Could it be used for things like warehousing after a disaster? Because you end up with masses of leftover plastic sheeting. But it is, you know, it's there for a reason. This happens to be Oxfams because you know by the colour of the string. And they are stockpiled all over the world. They're very light to transport, and it literally just gets dropped after a disaster. But we would ask whether or not there is a better role for design in this. So this is moving into transitional. This is a school that was set up using plastic sheets in Port-au-Prince after the earthquake. Save the Children reported that 11 child-friendly spaces were functioning in Port-au-Prince within 6 days. Which is pretty impressive, and that's just through the use of plastic sheets. That's activities for about 3,500 children, which doesn't sound like an awful lot, but what you've just done is free up 3,500 families who are able to then go and start looking for food and start regenerating their livelihoods. So now moving into rehabilitation. 2,000 family tents were distributed within 10 days. 10,000 more were in the pipeline, which tells you a lot about the importance of infrastructure, because it took a while for infrastructure to recover. 9 settlement sites were established in and around Port-au-Prince within 10 days. It's a very, very natural impulse for people to settle, and it's crucially important for distribution after a disaster. Still looking at relief and rehabilitation. You can see in these images, it's quite interesting. You're working with a very low-skilled labour force. What happens in a disaster often is a lot of the people who have a skill set to build have probably been killed or are doing, you know, preoccupied with their families. So what you have to do in design is you have to try and think of ways to create something that can be put up very, very easily, made of lightweight component parts. Do you have Meccano here? We used to have Meccano, this game when we were kids. It's like a sort of set of sort of building blocks with kind of pegs through them, and these sort of things look very, very much like Meccano. And again, it's something that you have to think about in design if you're designing for post-disaster scenarios. Very, very simple fixings integrated into the design. What you end up with is fantastic spaces like these, which are very much rehabilitation, return to normalcy, able to resume daily activities. This is a mixed-use space, which is really, really important. You're recognising the cultural context that you're working in. A lot of people were saying, we need to get the schools up and running, we need to get the schools up and running. The school infrastructure in Haiti before the earthquake was bad. It obviously was much, much worse since the earthquake, but what really was important to Haitians and has survived are the church networks. So you have to recognise that you're not working in a vacuum. It's a cultural context that needs to be understood before you go wasting time putting up a school. So this is something that was, this particular structure was built with the purpose of serving both functions, both as a church gathering space, as a worship space, and as a school. Again, rehabilitation, this is an image of one of our pro bono engineers on the left and our CEO on the right, surveying damaged buildings in Haiti. The significant thing here is that in order to move out of the rehabilitation stage, because the next one's reconstruction, you need a substantial amount of resources. You need to clear sites, you need new materials, you need design expertise, you need time, you need skills. It's, this marks the major move from something that's sort of, a lot of the funding gets earmarked for relief and rehabilitation, and moving into reconstruction requires a lot of resources. Haiti has been stuck in rehabilitation for a long time, and I will go into detail about some of the reasons later, but you may well have seen in the press that there's been a lot of talk about how slow the reconstruction effort has been. However, it is happening. This is the Iron Market in downtown Port-au-Prince, which has just been rebuilt and beautifully painted. It was rebuilt by, well, with support of the Prince's Foundation, the Prince being my Prince of England, Prince Charles. He has a lot of time for community development and supports a huge amount of built environment initiatives in the UK and abroad. And this is one of them. The Iron Market was a symbol of national pride and was, as you can see, pretty much devastated. And has just been finished and reopened. So reconstruction can happen, but not without some pretty serious support behind it. If the Prince says that it can be rebuilt, then it will be rebuilt. The definition, for anybody who's into definitions of reconstruction, importantly, is the rebuilding of livelihoods, economy, social services, housing and infrastructure for long-term development. So we're not just talking about reconstruction in terms of a physical building, we're talking about livelihoods, economy, social services, and long-term development. This is very much an interdisciplinary field. There are a lot more things to think about than one building, and it's very, very important that as designers you recognise that that's the context that we're working in. There are some very fundamental principles behind reconstruction, one of which is to understand ownership. So who's going to own these buildings? You need to make sure that there's something that belongs to the community. There's a sense of civic pride. They know how to maintain them. It's been constructed using local resources and local skills. And also, this is where we start talking about disaster proofing. Took me a while, but I've got there. This is where you start talking about mitigation and prevention, and you build with that in mind. You build something, you build in disaster proofing to your building and your design, and we'll look more about how you do that. It has taken a very long time in Haiti, partly because of funding issues, but mainly because the international development community are waiting for disaster-proofing codes, DRR codes, to be drafted and are unable to build until those are in place. So we're waiting for political and governmental support. It is very, very frustrating that recovery is taking so much longer, say, than in Chile, where they had very robust reconstruction codes, well, earthquake-resistant codes. But it is something that we're waiting, and that is something that doesn't get to the media very much, that the reconstruction efforts are being frustrated by a lack of political will. A very good example of where political will is on the side of the planners is Japan, where they're incredibly good at mitigation efforts. They have been dealing with earthquakes for a very, very long time, and their understanding of mitigation is quite sophisticated. Mitigation is eliminating, you can actually eliminate the effects of a hazard. Eliminating or minimising the effects of a disaster, translating lessons learnt into preparation for the next disaster, and reducing negative impact on the future. So you have to have your eye on this when you're reconstructing, when you're thinking about relief and how to use plastic sheeting. Japan enjoys a lot of governmental support, which Haiti doesn't, around policy. They have a Disaster Countermeasures Basic Act of 1961. Around education, they have a Disaster Prevention Day, which is at the beginning of the school year, so all the kids get involved. And in the built environment, they have all sorts of subsidies, tax breaks, building codes, zoning. This is a plan which is supposed to be incredibly sort of publicly accessible, but only if you can read Japanese, of where the different areas are that would be safe to go in the event of an earthquake. And that box on the right flashes like crazy, and they are all over the place, literally everywhere. A very tangible example of the built environment playing a key role in mitigating the effects of a disaster. There's also a lot of non-governmental support, local preparedness. Lots of local collaboration. So, for example, communities map their streets so they know where the elderly live, and they make sure that they're there first to evacuate them in the event of a disaster. Lots of local radio, kind of maximising the reach. And that really is a symbol that the government are doing something right, because if you don't have governmental support behind DRR, the community aren't encouraged to manage their own capacity to cope. Again, we're going back to this idea of vulnerability and reducing vulnerability. But because they do it so well, the communities have taken it on themselves to make public service announcements and map their communities and things like that. So the need for support from multiple sectors is pretty apparent, particularly from the political sector, which is a major problem with the reconstruction in Haiti. And it's very, very important to realise that it, as lovely as it would be, and in the flurry of kind of enthusiasm to help after these things happen, there is red tape, there are things you have to wait for, and there are a lot of different actors to consider, including political is usually the major one. Okay, so finally, moving from mitigation into preparedness stage. I love this image. It's all well and good to have an evacuation route designed into your building which is seismically resistant and so on. But if you don't know how to use that route, that's what we mean by preparedness. We're talking about logistical readiness, is what they often describe it as, the ability of citizens to put mitigation methods into practice. So things like evacuation drills, so you know how to use your evacuation routes. Also reserves, which has a huge impact on the built environment, having stockpiles of food and medicines. If you think about the different demands of warehousing for like dry goods and then warehousing for medicine, it's completely different. You've got different temperatures, you've got all sorts of things that you need to think about. And that we've just done a big workshop with the London Metropolitan University looking at rapidly deployed warehousing after disasters. And they had some really interesting ideas for temperature control. Not something that's hugely well researched, and certainly an area where design is the only thing that can really figure that out. So this image shows obviously prevention and preparedness methods, and that, I think, those are the pillows that they sit on during class. What that shows, it's on their heads, so it's very much an indication that they recognise that it is going to be something falling on your head. It's going to be part of a building, more than likely, that will kill you in a disaster. It's nothing else. It's, as I say, if you're standing in a field, you're probably going to be okay. The hazard bit is the bit that we can't control, but the vulnerability is something that we can certainly reduce. I finished talking about the disaster response cycle and the shelter and walking through the phases, but I think, again, I want to remind you that this isn't temporally linked. A couple of very interesting pieces of research have been done about how these phases are very, very much linked to each other, and it's not a linear process. For example, looking into Bangladesh flooding, which happens very regularly, it's been proven that community-level disaster preparedness planning, which begins immediately after in the relief phase, reduces post-disaster anxiety. So if you don't remember that actually all these stages of the cycle are very, very sort of interconnected to each other, then you miss a trick. And for design, if you aren't aware of the mechanisms that you can build into your response constantly, then you miss being able to apply your design skills in the most appropriate way possible, where they can have such a huge impact, literally, on people's lives. While we're on Bangladesh, just briefly, there are some very interesting design techniques in Bangladesh I've just heard about these recently, to disaster-proof buildings. They suffer regular flooding. So stilts is the obvious thing, put your building on stilts. But I've read recently of an initiative that's sort of sacrificial housing. So it's on a concrete plinth, and the plinth remains, but the building is made of a mud composite. So the building intentionally washes away in the floods, and then it can then be built again from the surrounding land, because it's all natural materials. So I thought that was a very clever way of thinking about sort of short-term and long-term relief and reconstruction, and trying to get those phases linked up, or in some way kind of break the conceptual barriers between how you respond in each phase. Certainly got nothing to do with plastic sheets. Okay, so I'll stop talking about that. I've gone off on one. So what we're going to talk about now is this joined up thinking, and I've started to unpack it a bit for you, the difference between short-term and long-term, or the lack of difference between short-term and long-term, and the need to see those stages not as any kind of temporal distinction. They're not necessarily tied to time frames, and design is very much capable of cracking that conundrum and sort of straddling the needs, if you like, of the short and the long term. This image is of a research project that we did, again with the University of Sheffield, we were approached by a camp manager for an IDP, an internally displaced persons camp in Sudan. They have major problems with water shortage, so although the camp manager desperately wanted to turn his IDP camp from a load of tents into something more permanent, they needed water to bind the mud bricks, and they couldn't get any, because it's a very, very arid region, and they needed the water to drink and to wash and so on. So we did a piece of research into using the water after it had been drunk, and these are urine-bound mud blocks, which was a really interesting piece of research. It is so fascinating. It turns out urea is a much more effective binding agent than water is. It was subjected to all sorts of tests, blast tests, compression tests, everything, and it actually performs an awful lot better. And I'm delighted that there's a prototype sitting in my office. But it works, and what it illustrates is its design that can open up that problem between short-term and long-term, or just get rid of this issue of temporal distinctions between responses. It's another image that I don't like. So after that note, it is quite serious what we're talking about here, and this is an example of an IDP camp where those kind of measures have not, there is no way that this is ever going to turn into something more permanent. People live like this in these kind of camps for 10 plus years. This is from Somalia, this image. And as you can see, remember that image I showed you earlier with the kids in the UNHCR plastic sheeting in Haiti? That is a UNHCR tent, and it's been there a hell of a lot longer than it should have been. These kind of situations develop literally into their own disasters if no mitigation prevention is put in place, like trying to figure out how to build out of mud bricks. It's exactly the kind of context where that kind of design has the power to unlock those sort of problems. Over half of southern Sudan live like this, which is a fairly terrifying statistic that I only looked up to come here and talk to you about, and because Sudan, as you know, southern Sudan will be gaining its independence later this year. There has been absolutely no investment in any kind of relocation of mass populations or any kind of public service infrastructure, and southern Sudan will have a huge amount to get their head around in terms of turning these kind of camps into more permanent settlements after they regain independence. So I would advise you to keep your eye on it. It's certainly one where you might see quite a few clever design initiatives popping up. I would hope that quite a few clever design initiatives pop up. So that's an example of it done really, really badly, and this is an example of a fantastic initiative looking at transitional housing in Haiti. This is Oxfam's housing. Oxfam is an organisation we know very well, but we've never had to work for because they are one organisation that really understand the importance of design. Really interesting efforts. This is a transitional housing kit for a particular settlement site in Jacmel, which is one of the suburbs of Port-au-Prince. So I know it looks pretty straightforward, but it's a really quite a clever design. It's all flat packed, so it can come on one pallet. And the cost of transport after a disaster is huge because there's so much demand to get supplies in. So it's all one kit, and actually the pallets that they come on are then used as component parts for the design, which is quite a common response actually, and is one that you should think about. I think some of the bracing ones, I think some of those are from the pallets. It's also made a very interesting cultural distinction, which is incredibly important in Haiti. Like in a lot of countries, you see this culture of sitting outside your front door. It's not something we really do in the UK, and I don't know how much you do it here, but it certainly is very important in Haiti. So this has made the distinction between public, semi-private, and private space, which is very important for a community that's going through some sort of trauma. Really interestingly, if you think back to the definition of reconstruction and rebuilding livelihoods and economies, that lock is all it takes, because you can then lock your sewing machine away and you can have a sense of security in being able to rebuild your own livelihood and start to generate an income. You can have kits, you can store cloth, you can store whatever it is that you're making your livelihoods from, making your income from rather. And it's something as simple as a lock. I know that's not some huge sort of design feature, but it's something that only somebody who had thought about the design of this kit would be able to do. And trust me, a hell of a lot of these kits pop up that don't have any locks on them. And it causes problems, it causes a lot of vandalism, a lot of security threats. certainly a lot of the camps in Haiti had major problems with child abuse and sexual abuse, and it's things like this that managed to avoid that. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of, again, try and remember this business of joined up thinking. This is an example of our earthquake-resistant housing in Pakistan. Really remote region, as you can see. It was built with local materials, so straw, mud, stone, timber, and some sheet metal. But basically, the majority of those materials could be easily salvaged from the surrounding area and from collapsed buildings. You could actually salvage some of the materials that you needed from the buildings that had already come down, basically reducing the need for costly transport to a very, very remote area. It's a combination of a local vernacular construction plus Article 25 design. That was really important because a lot of the labour force had been killed and we had to rely on skills that were already in the community, like time-honoured, hundreds of years old skills that we knew were already there. And this is called a dajidar technique. It means a patchwork. The next image I'll explain to you a little bit more about the way that it works. Oh, I shall do it now. What it is it's many, many small timber bracings, which are then infilled, you'll see in the next photograph, with stone and mud. And what you're doing, basically, is maximising the number of areas, the number of surfaces, the number of joints that can dissipate the energy of the earthquake when it strikes. So the whole building is designed to shake, and it probably will shake. There's no kind of major strapping. There is some strapping, but we actually wanted an award for the strap, believe it or not, because it's very basic steel strapping. So it is designed to be able to shake and to absorb that energy. The roof is a very, very lightweight sheet metal, which we did have to carry up the mountain, unfortunately. But that was to adhere to government regulations. So again, this business of regulations is kicking in. You can't just work in a vacuum. You've got to adhere to the red tape. But what it means is that the component parts, it's unlikely to fall down. If it does fall down, it's unlikely that any of those component parts are going to kill you. If you take a direct hit to the temple, then yes, it may kill you, but it's unlikely that it's going to kill you. I have to be careful what I say sometimes. Yeah, it's unlikely it'll kill you. And then if it's down, you can then probably salvage the parts to rebuild the building again. So it's just design that's come up with this. So you can see there that stone and mud infill and those really complicated braces and the lightweight materials. And you can sort of see as well the kind of terrain we're talking about here. So you really want to minimise what you need to carry up that hill. Like the image on the first image in Congo. It wasn't a 3-day walk, but it was extremely, extremely long way. Starting to talk about participatory design or development, these are some images showing that each building was very much a training program for local members. And when we were approached by Muslim Aid, we were approached to design a training program. The houses were a byproduct. We were capacity building, which is a real buzzword in the developing world, for local construction workers to be able to generate skills and rebuild economies and livelihoods. Things like 3-dimensional models, 1-to-1 models, 3-dimensional drawings. You can't put architectural drawings in front of people like this. They can't read them. And it's hopeless because you need people to be able to understand it because they're the ones that are going to need to maintain it. So you have to think about your ways of communication. We've done lots of really interesting graphics projects looking at communication and how literally like bills of quantities can become a training exercise in themselves. This is an image of it almost finished. Nearing completion, just the mud render being applied. Quite interestingly, the mud render is then painted to look like concrete. Believe it or not, even though these buildings had come down and killed an awful lot of friends and family, concrete in the developing world is often the key indicator of progress. And people have expectations and want modernisation, and they want things to be built in modern materials. So we actually had to build, we've done this a few times again, I gave another example earlier. We had to build a concrete house next to one of these dajidar houses to show them how much longer it took, how much more money it took. It was an absolute pain, to be honest. But you can't just impose a Western solution. It's something that you have to be very aware of, that you're working in a cultural context that has completely different interpretations to what you get trained in New York or London or wherever it may be. this is a real tangible example of design bridging the gap between short and long term, and exploding the sort of linear understanding of disaster response, because these houses were delivered in 100 days, which is not a long time. And I mean, by all accounts, you'd be stuck in relief phase and you wouldn't be able to get any funding for the reconstruction phase. There were a number of major international agencies in the area where we were working, and their large-scale relief efforts often used very temporary materials, such as tents, which are completely inappropriate when the seasons change. I don't know if you can think back to, a lot of people froze to death that winter because they were still living in tents. There were people on the ground working around us who were still waiting for their plastic sheeting to be delivered by the time these were finished. So that really, there's no point in talking about timelines, short term and long term, very much something that you have to be thinking about in the same conversation. Okay, I'm not going to explain this in great detail, but while we're talking about joined up efforts, it's incredibly important that you're still thinking about a holistic view of the situation and a holistic view of knowledge, and whose people's knowledge are playing a key part in the response and disaster proofing, and whose authority there is, and how it's very powerful when you team up people's knowledge. A lot of economic work has been done around disaster recovery and boosting economies, and this is produced by the International Rescue Committee, the IRC, who we work with quite closely. And what it is it's a toolkit designed to analyse trade routes. So what you do is you map, this is I think for beans, yeah, this is bean producers. I couldn't find one for bricks, there is one for bricks knocking around somewhere. This is bean producers before and after a disaster has happened. So what you do is you map the trade routes, and which ones have been broken and which ones have been retained after a disaster. So what you do is you then identify which ones to work with, which ones to boost to help restart the local economy and help strengthen it. What you're not doing is creating a handout culture, which is so easy to create after a disaster and is actually incredibly dangerous for the long term and is not a sustainable solution at all. So your reconstruction efforts, if you were to do this for your material palette immediately after a disaster, you can then understand exactly which lines of import and trade still exist and then work with them, and you've set your parameters for what materials you've got to use. And this is an image of what's known as the shelter cluster. This is moving quite into international development now. After the Asian tsunami, the UN decided, well, a combination of people, but yeah, the UN more or less decided that there needed to be a more efficient system of response and a more formal effort to join up thinking and avoid duplication. There was a lot of duplicated efforts after the tsunami, particularly in rebuilding, and a need to coordinate efforts to make them more efficient. So they set up the cluster system. And what there is there are various different working groups that exist after a disaster happens. So there's a group to address nutrition, there's a group to address public health, they were called clusters. There's a cluster to address telecoms, cluster to address security. In fact, security is the only one that's missing. It might well go through soon. And there's one to address shelter. And this is an example of real formal efforts in the international development sector to try and join up thinking. And this is a meeting of the shelter cluster. There are some really large organisations, you can recognise the IFRC, and smaller organisations as well. And they meet regularly. They're still meeting. And actually, you can sign up for shelter cluster updates just through Google Groups. Anyone can. I get them in my inbox, so I know what's going on the ground. It's very interesting. And God forbid, if and when another one happens, I'd recommend you sign up, because it really gives you an insight into what the real challenges are on the ground on a daily basis. Okay, so briefly, we're going to talk about participatory development, and then I'll just round up for you. Does anyone have any questions so far? Actually, I think we have a Q&A at the end, so I better hurry up. So this is what I was saying earlier about design not being the only authority in these situations. And I would in no way want to undermine the amount of training that a designer has gone through, and they are undoubtedly the best person to be advising on those things. But it is incredibly important that when it's teamed with the knowledge of other people, it becomes much, much more powerful. And for example, I've just shown you how economic knowledge can become much more powerful. But if you look to the actual people who have an interest in that building, you will generate a more sustainable response. It's very, very easy to forget about them. It's much more of an urban design planning thing, but it's very important to remember a kind of lived experience of a building. So, for example, with the school reconstruction project in Haiti, when you think about reconstructing a school in a post-disaster scenario, And then you need to bear in mind it needs to be disaster proof. It needs to mitigate risk. It needs to boost the economy. It needs to use local skills. Like, it's a pretty tall order. Like, there's quite a lot to get in there. But what I think the starting point is to consider lots of different actors with their own agendas and each with their own specialist knowledge to add to the process. And it's only by working with them that you can try and reconcile all of those different demands. So these are the kind of sort of initial actors that jump to mind. The government, we've talked about building codes. The NGOs, for example, Article 25 are working with Outreach International in Haiti. The designers, the planners, the engineers, all the extra designers that sort of get tagged onto the process. The funders, they're pretty important people. The cluster systems I've just shown you. Then you think about the people who are going to use the building. And that's just the way we're trained. But it's important to remember that they're there, and it's important to remember that they are the ones that will be able to determine the efficiency of the project. The students that use the building, the school networks, so the teachers who teach there, or often you get teachers who aren't prepared to teach there anymore because of the environment they're teaching in, and then the parents. So you're starting to extend the number of actors who have an interest in this building. And in the case of Haiti, what we discovered is that there are even more actors, like the local gang leaders have a huge invested interest in the school infrastructure because it's so rubbish. That's why an awful lot of kids drop out of school and end up joining gangs. So the criminal infrastructure is incredibly strong. And in order to try and prevent that happening again, we have to put some serious thought into why these buildings aren't managing to retain their students and what we could do in an environmental way to try and retain them. And the local church networks, as I spoke to you earlier, the education infrastructure collapsed completely. It's the church networks that we've had to work through. So we had to really broaden our understanding of the stakeholders involved. This is another bit of theory for you. This is called the ladder of citizen participation, which has actually been around for a really long time. This was published in 1969. It's basically the idea of engaging a community, and it's worth considering or plotting all of your stakeholders against this ladder and where they come in a design process to keep reminding yourself that there are multiple decision makers going on. So at the bottom you get manipulation, therapy even, and informing. There isn't necessarily anything wrong with informing people about what you're going to do. You are the designers and you are the ones that know the most about how to achieve a particular outcome from a building. There isn't necessarily anything wrong with that, but when it turns into manipulation, then it does start to become a problem. And a lot of governments tend to, some governments tend to exercise this in sort of corrupt ways. And then moving up, you get consultation. Interestingly, in the UK, it's called public consultation. So this is where I have my real bugbear about us having to go to these meetings called consultation. Consultation doesn't imply you have to take anybody's advice on board. You just have to consult them, and then you don't have to do anything with it. And don't get me started. And then moving up, partnership. That's very much what we try and achieve. And sort of the be-all and end-all of it is a citizen population who take control of their own priorities and their own design ideas and instigate their own efforts. It doesn't happen that often. Anyway, the point is to show you that there are a lot of actors involved, and it is important and possibly very useful to plot them against different levels. You can't have everybody involved at maximum capacity the whole time. You'll just get paralysis. I'm sure you've done a lot of teamwork, right? And you can end up with just not moving anywhere because everybody's got different opinions. So trying to balance those opinions is something that you really need to consider. You've all just rolled your eyes. I know the feeling. So the way to do this is certainly from our point of view, is to understand local need and the priorities which will generate a better design response. For example, this is an image from our Gola Forest project, a project in Sierra Leone, which is a reconstruction project after a man-made disaster, which is war. The project is to build national park infrastructure in an area of rainforest which sits on the Sierra Leone-Liberian border, and it's part of a peace-building process between those two countries after decades of civil war. So it's a pretty major reconstruction effort, not just reconstructing livelihoods and generating new sort of ecotourism income opportunities, but also looking after the natural habitat, which is very much something that both governments have recognised as part of post-war reconstruction, interestingly. So it's a new headquarters building, it's a staff village, a community centre, a health clinic, a school, couple of other bits and pieces. It's a big master plan. So what we're doing is we are trying to rebuild livelihoods, strengthen capacity to cope, God forbid, if there's another disaster such as war, and reduce vulnerability. This image is an image from a workshop that we ran with the local community, and these are women. They live literally abject poverty. This is about as low as it goes. The idea of a school is completely ridiculous. There is no infrastructure around water, electricity, anything like that. But these women are telling us about their environment and how they perceive their environment, which has big implications for funding. I would recommend looking at something called Relief Web if you're interested, which on a daily basis will give you a daily update of what disasters have occurred that day, believe it or not, which is largely, that has a big implication on why the Pakistan flooding, for example, did not elicit anywhere near as many public funds as the Haitian earthquake did earlier that year. The second thing that shows is that we are talking about the short term and the long term and how to think across those boundaries. Reimagining this model does help you to look forwards, which is what we've been talking about. So what are we actually working towards? Like what are we talking about when we're talking about disaster proofing? The UNISDR, which is one of the hundreds of UN bodies, is the ones who work towards a strategy for disaster reduction. And they are incredibly vocal about the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, not being possible to achieve without effective disaster risk reduction in place. The MDGs are all the goals across the top. They are things which 146 member states of the UN agreed to achieve by 2015. They're incredibly ambitious. Eradicating extreme poverty and hunger, reducing child mortality, ensuring environmental sustainability. They are incredibly ambitious, but if you need to know anything, you need to know about these MDGs as the key framework and the key kind of system that we're working by here. And we're working to achieve the Millennium Development Goals, which is impossible without disaster risk reduction strategies. And likewise, the reason Article 25 exists is to uphold those human rights, so we're working towards the MDGs as well. The phrase that is always used amongst the UN and otherwise is you're generating a culture of security in which the Millennium Development Goals can be achieved. And in so doing, achieve universal human rights. So these are some examples of where the built, because it can be quite a tenuous link, of where the built environment literally allows for a Millennium Development Goal to be achieved. Eradicating extreme poverty and hunger. You cannot distribute food in these kind of environments. These are images from the Pakistan flooding without effective roads and effective networks in place, and it's the built environment's responsibility to do that. Achieving universal primary education, that is a school building in Sierra Leone. There is no way you're going to achieve universal primary education in that. And ensuring environmental sustainability. This is the photo that's been on the posters, and this is a girl standing outside her school, which collapsed in Port-au-Prince. And as we've said, there is a timber shortage in Haiti. So what on earth do we build back with there in an environmentally sustainable way? So this is it. This is the last image. And I always try and finish on an image because I think it really sticks with you. And this one, this is an image from a school called the Handmade School in Rudrapur, which has won the Aga Khan Award for architecture, which is the biggest humanitarian architecture award out there, designed by a lady called Anna Heringer. It's a very sophisticated, very successful design. You can see it's very design heavy. It's a school. And it is a very clever idea. The stated aim of the building is looking at spaces affecting behaviours, and listen to this bit, looking at long-term and preventing a disaster such as rural degeneration or problems associated with mass urban migration, such as slum developments. This building is particularly designed in order to encourage the local community to have a pride in their sense of space and their environment, and to educate children about how to use their environment and stay in a rural setting in order to generate sustainable livelihoods for the long term. So as you can see, it can be something really conceptual, the understanding of the role of design in mitigating disasters. And I think perhaps this is a better starting point for when you're in academia to sort of think around the concept of disasters. It doesn't have to be an earthquake. It can be really something quite conceptual. Our responsibility is to engage with international development and DRR and disaster proofing, reducing risk and through reducing vulnerabilities. We need to understand context, stakeholders involved, political will, economic forces. But above all, you need to understand the populations themselves and work with them. You're not working for them, you're not generating a handout, you're working with them to create a solution that will hold them in good stead for solutions in the face of future disasters. I hope this has shown both that the range of stakeholders is extensive and that good design is not limited to one point in a disaster response cycle. It may well challenge our role as key decision makers, but it's a challenge that we have to take up, I feel, and Article 25 feel, in order to try and create communities that are able to cope in the face of future disasters themselves. So that's where I'm going to finish. I'd just like to say thank you again to Syracuse for being quite so open-minded about me talking about this thing, and as I gather there is quite a lot of interest here in looking at this agenda particularly. So I think I've gone on a bit, but I think we're now going to go to questions and answers. Is that right? Thank you all very much for listening to the sound of my voice. I apologise if you couldn't understand me.
Okay, so I think we have time for just 2 questions from the audience.
I guess, is there a relationship between the time it takes to get from a disaster to the start of the reconstruction phase and the length of the reconstruction phase? Because, I mean, I know it can take a very long time to get from urine brick huts to a city. Like, that takes a long time, and I'm wondering if the time it takes to get from plastic tent to urine brick hut, if that can be shortened, the time it takes to get sustainable urban environment would be dramatically shortened. Okay.
You know you've spoken right when you get really tough questions. I think there is a relationship, and I think they are proportional. But I think there are a few things. You're not necessarily, by making one of them shorter, you might actually be making the other one longer, and vice versa. For example, in Haiti, the relief phase officially has been extended and extended and extended, which is totally hampering reconstruction efforts. However, the second we are allowed to rebuild, we are well and truly ready. Like, we know the people, we know the materials, we know where to get it from. So it should be a much shorter process. Having said that, political will can override the whole thing, and if Prince Charles wants to rebuild the iron market, then he will. So they're not necessarily, there's a lot of political bargaining that goes on around that. The other thing as well, I think that's really important, is to look for catalysts. So you don't necessarily, I think, trying to think about comprehensive rehabilitation before you can reconstruct isn't necessarily the right approach. I think you can definitely look for catalysts and sort of sparks to build that will encourage other things to happen around it. For example, we're working in Uganda at the moment in a what is a former IDP camp in the south. It has now become a fairly desolate village, and people have built their own sort of straw huts and things. But the government, interestingly, have started investing in the infrastructure, and what they've done, which people have done for centuries, is invest in civic buildings. So they've built a police station, and they've built a roundabout. I know it sounds ridiculous, but think of the Arc de Triomphe. Like, it's a real focal point for a community to sort of start regaining a sense of pride. And if you, quite often development efforts will target things like that, that will then generate enthusiasm in the community for them to rebuild themselves. Things like street lighting can go a really long way to helping kids have somewhere to study after dark. So if you can't get on with reconstruction, you can possibly get on with looking for catalysts and things like that. Does that help? Scratching the surface, it's a big question, but it's a very interesting one, I think. Hey.
Hello.
Hi.
I just have a very brief question on wondering how much you interact with discourses like, I have 2 very different ones, one being permaculture and local knowledges, which you did kind of touch on, and the other being climate change mitigation and adaptation.
Yeah.
The 2 different...
I think things like climate change, well, particularly the Gola Forest project is probably the best example of that in Sierra Leone. Climate change is something that we have to engage with, and designers have to engage with it more and more, whether it's through just sheer enforcement in their country or actually trying to figure out a solution. The way that we do it, I mean, in a way we're blessed because we're working with low tech, and we have to make sure it's locally sustainable, it's energy efficient. We have to, create a life cycle for buildings that is as long as possible, or if not, with very basic maintenance to continue. So for example, that Pakistan housing, that mud render won't last for more than 3-4 years, and it needs to be replaced, but it's just mud. So in a way we are quite blessed. We also do bring in, on the Gola Forest project in Sierra Leone, we will bring in environmental specialists. It's not necessarily skills that we can have in-house the whole time as much as we'd love to. So that is one way that we engage with that particular discourse. Around permaculture, it's actually something that I'm really fascinated by, but it's not something that we've had a huge amount of exposure to. We're currently talking to a couple of organisations in Australia, and I don't know if you know, but in Australia they're big on permaculture, and they want to work with us on a student research project that we currently have, which is a group of an agricultural community that were forcibly kicked off their land a few years ago. They've now been re-granted their land by the government on the condition that they build, and they want to build an eco-settlement. And what they've done is spent about a year looking at permaculture, and these Australian agencies want to work with us, with this community in Colombia, to understand how to resettle in an environmentally sustainable way. And actually our students are the ones doing that research at the moment. So again, it's something that we don't have in-house, but definitely all those sort of agendas are ones that we definitely have to engage with, I think. And I think the important thing for us is recognising where we're ignorant, well, not ignorant, but where we're less skilled and where we need to be bringing in expertise of other people. And certainly I don't get to work on that project as directly as I'd like to, but I know that these organisations, these two organisations in Australia are fascinating, the sort of work that they do around permaculture, and they have been forward thinking enough to recognise that can have a massive impact in developing situations and developing countries. Okay.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Well, we'd like to thank everyone for coming. Stephanie for sharing this critical information. For the School of Architecture and supporting this event, for Professor Anna French and the lecture committee and helping us bring Stephanie, and of course our e-board, SMED members, and giving your time to make this happen. And finally, all of you for coming and listening to this, which has taken time and dedication to bring and to make it happen. But finally, we hope that you take this information and actually think about it, process it, and as Stephanie said, even consider making it happen here locally. And finally, there's a reception down in the atrium. Come and converse with Stephanie. Thank you.